Perhaps you've wondered whether the Buddha literally taught that there was no self, that you didn't have a self, I didn't have a self, that there were literally no selves in the world. This is a question I want to get into in today's video. And I think, well, if you look at some introductory texts about Buddhism, some introductions to Buddhist philosophy or theory or thought, you may indeed hear people say that the Buddha taught that there were no selves. Where does this idea come from? Well, the Buddha's idea about the self was he used by expressing a term in Sanskrit and Pali. The Pali term is anatta, the Sanskrit term is anatman. How do we understand this term? One way that it could be translated is literally as no self, anatta, anatman. Atman means self or soul in Sanskrit or in Pali, and the an is obviously a denial, so you can understand it as literally no self. However, understanding it in that way, understanding the Buddha's teaching as a teaching literally of no self, that there were no selves, gets us into a number of very deep problems. If there are literally no selves, then there's no point to ethical action. There's nobody being harmed, there's nobody being helped, there are no actions that are better for anybody or worse for anybody. There's no point to us being either benefited or harmed by the actions that we take. And nobody is at fault or praiseworthy in what they do, because they don't exist. There's no point to practice because there's nothing to actually get better, nobody to improve through practice. So, and these, it's important to stress, these are all positions, the positions I've just said, which the Buddha himself rejects. He rejects them through the positions of some of his competitors at the time. I did an earlier video about those competitors, I'll leave a link to it down below in the show notes. But in a very small nutshell, the Buddha had a number of competitors who said very similar things, that there were no praiseworthy or blameworthy actions, that nobody was helped or harmed, that nobody was killed by slicing a sword through them, these kinds of things, and the Buddha rejected those theories as incorrect, as indeed, we might even say, ethically condemnable in a certain way. So the Buddha did not hold to such a theory. Indeed, in one early sutta, the Buddha actually explicitly rejects the claim that myself absolutely does not exist. He rejected that. He also, in other suttas, talks about the self at some length. In one sutta, he talks about the importance of putting oneself in charge, in fact, by which he means making a concerted and ongoing effort towards bettering oneself, towards making one's mind stream purer, if you like. The view that the Buddha taught literally no self, that there were no selves, makes the Buddha Dharma out to be a kind of nihilism, or in the Buddha's words, an annihilationism, at least from a certain kind of perspective. In one early text, the Buddha says, "Certain ascetics and Brahmins misrepresent me with the false, hollow, lying, untruthful claim the ascetic Gautama is an exterminator. He advocates the annihilation, eradication, and obliteration of an existing being." In the Buddha's understanding, the existence claim, the point that these ascetics and Brahmins are making, is that to exist is to be permanent, is to exist permanently. And that was kind of the way philosophically that these things were understood in the Buddha's day. That existence is a grand claim about something. For something to exist, it has to be permanent. And that indeed is exactly what the Buddha is denying. The Buddha is denying that the self is permanent. In denying that, however, he's not exterminating anything, because such a permanent self never existed. It's a figment of our imagination. However, in the Buddha's understanding, a kind of self exists in a way of speaking, in a manner of speaking. That is, there are temporary mind states and physical states that coalesce and come together in a stream of causes and conditions, and that stream of causes and conditions can be seen as a self. And it can be seen or thought of as a self because its intentions carry ethical importance. the things that it does now, the things that it intends now and carries out now, are going to redound upon it in the future for benefit or for ill. So if this stream of causes and conditions that constitutes me or you intends and acts in certain ways that are, let's say, filled with kindness and compassion, that's liable to redound upon me and you for benefit. And the opposite, if what we're doing depends upon intentions of greediness or hatred. These intentions redound upon us in the future, even though the stream is always changing. There's nothing literally permanent within it. And since this stream is always changing, there's nothing literally the same, so it's not literally the same self over time, because it's always again changing. If we're familiar with the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus, he had a very famous quote that you can't step into the same river twice. And this is often taken to mean, correctly I suppose, that you can't because the river is always changing. In other words, you step into it once, you move your foot out, and by the time you've moved your foot, the river has changed sufficiently so that it's a different river you're stepping into the next time. But that's also true of the person doing the stepping, that they too are different from moment to moment, from instant to instant. And so the same person is not found either when stepping into this river. Nevertheless, we appear to have a self in an important way because the states within this stream are causally oriented with one another, causally condition each other in ways that have ethical significance, both for ourselves and for the broader world around us. However, the problem in Buddhism is that once we begin to see this ever-changing stream as a self, we begin to construct all kinds of views and theories and beliefs about this self. And those views and theories and beliefs inevitably become permanentized in a way, if you like. That's not really a word, but you get the point, that we tend to think of ourselves as something permanent. We look at this stream of who we are and we say, my personality is such and so, I prefer this, I am of this political party. We identify ourselves with all kinds of things in the world. I'm a person of this society, I'm a person of this country, I'm a person who roots for this team. All of these different ways that we identify ourselves with things in the world, trying to, and even without trying to, just in fact permanentizing ourselves, thinking of this ever-changing stream as something that is unchanging. That is, these self-views originate, in fact, in a kind of a tendency to cling to things in the world, identify ourselves with things in the world, and the self-views that also make clinging more likely. Is that once we think we've come up with an idea of who we really are, then we tend to want to associate ourselves with things that we see as similar to us. If we think of ourselves as being particularly compassionate, let's say, then we start identifying things around us, people around us who are compassionate, or things that represent compassion to us, and we start identifying with those. And these kinds of moves, these kinds of identifications and clingings that come up with these self-views, in the longer term, produce in us a sense of unsatisfactoriness. How so? Well, because we are always changing, as is the outside world. What this means is that we ourselves cannot live up to our own best intentions all the time. And the outside world even less can live up to our own best intentions, or our own best expectations, shall we say, for it. And as things change both within us and outside of us, we are continually being let down, because we are continually being surprised at how things don't work the way we want them to. So the most skillful thing we can do for the Buddha, basically, is to give up on theories of self, to give up on views about what a self is or what our self, who we are, to give up on this kind of long-term project of figuring out who we really are. because that way only leads towards dukkha, towards suffering, towards a sense of unsatisfactoriness. And this will leave some space for us to come up with a more skillful and fluid understanding of the self that allows for the kind of change which is natural to all things. As we relax around our concept of the self, I think a more skillful, we might even say true self, although it isn't really, that even to say that is too much, but a more skillful way of being in the world simply arises. So, to get back to our original question, does the Buddha literally say that there is no self? Well, no, he doesn't. In fact, he says quite the reverse. In other words, he rejects the claim that there is literally no self. On the other hand, what he does say is that the concept of a self, views of a self, beliefs about who we really are not helpful to us along the path. But also in the same way, neither is our self nothing. That's another kind of view, that is to say that we are literally nothing, that we don't exist, that we don't have a self. This is another kind of view and another way that we can get ourselves tripped up. So when we look at these words that we began with, anatta and anatman, the words that the Buddha used, or the word that the Buddha used to express this concept, I think it's better translated as non-self, something like non-self. In other words, whatever we see around us in the world, whatever we see around us in our minds, that is not who we are. So we look around outside, we don't see anything that we can really identify as who we really are. We look inside. There's nothing we can really identify as who we really are. This leaves open any kind of question about a self because it's just simply a question that we have to leave aside. And I've done a number of videos on this topic in case you're interested in a further deeper dive into the topic of self and non-self in Buddhism. I have a playlist on this subject, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen in case you want to see more. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please do check out my Patreon page. It's linked down below, and see if you want to join us. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.